I never expected my ex-wife's wedding to feel like the final public measure of my life. When her new husband sneered at me and suggested I cut ties with his wife, I made a choice that stopped the room cold. I told him calmly that I would close my $500 million account at her bank. The look on their faces was priceless, but that moment was only the overture. What followed was the slow, quiet composition of 20 years of hurt, turned into something unexpectedly sweet. My name is Daniel Morris. I'm 52 years old. I write music for films. Not the loud summer blockbuster scores that chase headlines, but delicate, precise compositions that live best inside thoughtful movies. For years my work reached a small, dedicated audience. Then, 7 years ago, everything shifted. I remember the day Susan told me she was leaving. It was 2008, the markets were collapsing, and the air tasted like fear. Outside, news tickers announced firms shuttering. Inside my studio, sunlight fell across an unfinished piano score. Susan stood in the doorway, arms folded, and told me our life needed stability I wasn't providing. I need security, she said. You're still chasing this dream. Her voice made dreams sound like a disease. She had a job in finance that brought in 3 times what I made. She was precise, efficient, always 10 moves ahead, I argued. We both knew the argument was pointless. Our daughter Emily was 9 then. Susan spoke of college funds, retirement, practicalities. She framed everything like a balance sheet, as if love were a liability. I didn't fight when she left. Maybe she expected a desperate, groveling man. Maybe she wanted that vindication. Instead, I packed a few cases and moved to a small Brooklyn apartment. I kept composing. I kept teaching. I kept my heartbeat steady on the keys. Susan climbed Bennett Financial's ladder. She became CFO. She moved into a suburban mansion that glittered with other people's approval. Emily divided her time between us. As she grew, she began to spend more hours curled on the battered couch in my apartment than beneath Susan's chandeliers. She liked the music, the mess, the piano that took up half my living room. And then came the film that changed my life. A small, tender movie about a jazz musician in 1960s New Orleans. I poured every quiet heartbreak and stubborn hope into that score. When the Academy called my name, the world shifted. Suddenly, I was the Oscar-winning composer. Suddenly, my phone rang with opportunities. Suddenly, the struggling artists labeled people had applied to me. It's like a cheap coat no longer fit. Success taught me more than money. It taught me patience, humility, and the satisfaction of building something on my terms. I started a production company. I invested thoughtfully. I grew a life I could be proud of. Still, for the sake of manners and old ties, I kept an account at Bennett Financial. It felt like one small thread to Susan's life, a remnant of what we once were. So when the wedding invitation arrived, sitting on my Manhattan coffee table like a glossy afterthought, I hesitated. Susan was marrying Lawrence Grayson. Venture capitalist, polished, politically ambitious. He walked into rooms expecting to be admired. He glanced at me during parent-teacher conferences like I had been something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. All of that should have made my RSVP a simple no, a dead curiosity, or perhaps a quiet desire to show. Made me respond, yes. The evening of the wedding arrived with an amber sunset that made the Manhattan skyline look softer than it deserved. I adjusted my tie in the back seat of an Uber, listening to the city hum. The venue was a rooftop garden so exclusive it had its own rules of entry. Crystal chandeliers dangled under transparent canopies. White orchids spilled like waterfalls. Waiters glided between clusters of well-connected guests with flutes of champagne. The scene had been composed to show success like an exhibit. Susan had always known how to stage an entrance. Emily found me near the elevator. She wore the bridesmaid dress in a muted champagne shade. At 19, she looked more like Susan, everyday sharp cheekbones, measured posture except for her eyes. She had my crooked smile in the corner of them. "Dad," she said, surprised. "You actually came, wouldn't miss it." I lied and meant something different by it. We threaded through the crowd. I saw Jason, Susan's younger brother, across the room. He was the only family member who had stayed on my side. He embraced me genuinely. "Uncle Dan," he said, "success suits you." He wore a suit that hinted at tech money, not finance. I noticed him because he was warm and not calculated. Then I saw them. Susan, radiant and elegant, moved through the room with practiced grace. Her smile fit the moment like couture. Larry stood at her side. His silver hair and politician's handshake perfect for the cameras that weren't there. For a moment, when our eyes met, something like recognition flickered across her face. It was a small thing, a ghost of what we had once been. Then her smile reasserted itself and the moment passed. Larry introduced himself with the charm of a man who had practiced his lines. "So you're the ex-husband," he said. "Teach music, right?" There it was, a jab, soft and public. Susan amended his curt description. "Daniel composes film scores," she said, in the clipped tone of someone erasing complexities. Before I could expand on that, Emily jumped in and said plainly, "Dad won an Oscar for Midnight in New Orleans and he just signed with Paramount for a historical drama." Larry's practiced smile faltered. I felt a small warmth at my daughter's intervention. She had always been braver about telling truths. The ceremony glowed as the sun slipped behind skyscrapers. Susan walked down the aisle as if every step had been rehearsed. Wedding vows came and went. It occurred to me as they spoke that we had loved each other once, but in different keys. We had wanted different things. That thought oddly settled me at the reception. I sat at the periphery. People watched me the way audiences watch a mystery performer. Jason came by and whispered, "Half the room wonders why the ex-husband is here. The other half wonders if you're the same Daniel Morris who's changed film scoring." We clinked glasses and let the speculation simmer. Then Larry took the mic. He turned a wedding toast into a campaign speech. He praised proper choices and implied that Susan had made the sensible path by choosing him. The room tittered politely. I felt Susan's knuckled hand tighten around her champagne flute. She's always been guarded with her hands, a small tell I knew well. After the speech, as the music shifted toward dancing, Emily and I found a moment to talk. She told me Larry had been undermining her idea of interning at my studio. Pushing instead for internships in finance and politics, he believed loudly and proudly that the arts were a hobby, not a career. I kept my voice level. "Emily makes her own choices," I said. She nodded fierce and clear. Then, emboldened by alcohol and by an audience, Larry's contempt surfaced. "Cut ties with my wife's family," he suggested, loud enough for those nearest to hear. He meant me. He meant my presence. The demand was an attempt at erasure. There are moments when a quiet man chooses volume. I let him finish. Then, as if speaking about a weather forecast, I said, "You know what's uncomfortable, Larry? Having $500 million sitting in your wife's bank account while hearing you lecture about investments. I'll close my account on Monday." The room stopped. Conversations froze like records caught at the edge. For a beat, everyone looked at Larry. His color drained. Susan's face went pale, as if someone had taken the oxygen from the room. Jason's grin was impossible to miss. Larry tried to recover. "There must be some misunderstanding," he stammered. A few well-meaning guests attempted to smooth the air with nervous laughter, but the damage was done. When power is built on assumptions, a single, simple truth spoken without malice can undo the whole structure. Susan stepped forward, breathless and in a hallway away from the crowd, asked if it had been necessary. "I just made a business decision," I said. "I've been considering it for months." We stood in that liminal space between celebration and scandal. She looked at me, truly looked, and asked why I'd never told Larry or anyone about my success. "It would have complicated the story," she admitted. "Your story?" "My story." I listened as she confessed, in a softer voice, that she sometimes heard my music in films and knew it was mine before the credits confirmed it. There was a strange, honest moment there. We were two people who had tried, for decades, to justify choices with narratives. She had pruned me from her story to make her decisions seem rational. I had built a life I could stand in. For a brief second, those two truths touched. I left the reception with Emily in a taxi. Manhattan's light smeared by like notes on a page. She surprised me by saying she'd been thinking of deferring law school to study music production. She had found something in my studio that lit her up. "Law will be there later," I told her. "If this is what you want, follow it." She hugged me then, fierce and grateful. 3 months passed. Snow fell like punctuation over the city. One late night in the studio, my phone rang. It was Susan. She told me the bank was hosting an arts endowment dinner and they wanted me to keynote. She used the word unconventional to describe the theme. She said it was appropriate. I said yes. When she later told me that she and Larry were taking time apart, I felt none of the petty triumph I might once have imagined. I felt relieved for her and quietly satisfied that people's lives unfold in strange, unpredictable ways. She told me she'd supported Emily's decision to speak with me about music production. She sounded, for the first time in a long while, like someone able to accept nuance. I kept part of the account at Bennett Financial, as I'd said I would. I transferred most of the funds to investments that matched my values. I left enough to show there was no malice. The act of closing and reshaping my finances was never about proving a point. It was about aligning my life with what I had become. In the months that followed, I gave that keynote. I spoke about unconventional paths and the courage of staying true to a calling. People applauded. I signed a few checks to arts programs. Emily found her rhythm in the studio and began to build a portfolio that felt like hers. Susan and I exchanged updates that were quieter, truer. We found, in time, an odd kind of companionship anchored to a shared history and a daughter we both loved. When I look back on that wedding now, I don't call it revenge. The term feels small. Instead, I think of it as recognition. Recognition of who I always was and what I'd been quietly building. The real victory wasn't in humiliating Larry, although watching him squirm was an oddly satisfying note. The victory was in finally living the life I wanted unapologetically. It was in hearing my daughter decide on music because it called to her. It was in Susan, years later, telling me she'd always known my work was mine of him when she needed the story of failure to make sense of her choice. Some nights, I sit at my piano and play the first composition I wrote after we separated. It began mournful and then opened into something else, hopeful, resilient. The melody has become a refrain in my life. It reminds me that success sometimes arrives late and the dignity is often quieter than vindication. I no longer need people to admit they were wrong. I no longer crave applause. I have music, a daughter who believes in her own voice and a life composed of the choices I made. If that is revenge, it's a gentle one. If it's anything, it's proof that staying true to yourself, even when the world demands otherwise, eventually writes its own score.